Suwannee was laid down on 3 June 1938 at Kearny, New Jersey, by the Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company, under a Maritime Commission contract as Marquet, launched on 4 March 1939, sponsored by Mrs. Howard L. Vickery, delivered to the Keystone Tank Ship Corporation and operated by the company until acquired by the United States Navy on 26 June 1941. Renamed Suwannee, and commissioned on 16 July 1941. Commander Joseph R. Lanham in command. World War II. After operating for 6 months as an oiler with the Atlantic Fleet, Suwannee was redesignated CVE-27 on 14 February 1942 and decommissioned on 21 February at Newport News, Virginia, for conversion to a Sangamon-class escort carrier. On 20 August, she was redesignated an auxiliary carrier, a CVE-27, and was recommissioned as such on 24 September 1942, Captain Joseph J. Clark in command. Less than a month after commissioning, Suwannee was underway from Hampton Roads for the invasion of North Africa. She joined Ranger as the other carrier attached to the Center Attack Group, whose specific objective was Casablanca itself, via Fedala just to the north. Early in the morning of 8 November, she arrived off the coast of Morocco and, for the next few days, her Grumman F-4F Wildcats maintained combat and anti-submarine air patrols, while her Grumman TBF Avengers joined Rangers in bombing missions. During the naval battle of Casablanca from 8 to 11 November, Suwannee sent up 255 air sorties and lost only 5 planes, 3 in combat and 2 to operational problems. On the 11th of November, off Fedala Roads, her anti-submarine patrol sank what was reported to be a German U-boat, but which was later determined to have been one of the 3 French submarines which sortied from Casablanca on the day of the assault. She was the first escort carrier to score against the enemy undersea menace, and she helped to prove the usefulness of her type in anti-submarine warfare. Suwannee remained in North African waters until mid-November, then sailed, via Bermuda, for Norfolk. She arrived back at Hampton Roads on 24 November and stayed until 5 December, when she got underway for the South Pacific. The auxiliary carrier transited the Panama Canal on 11–12 December and arrived at New Caledonia on 4 January 1943. For the next 7 months, she provided air escort for transports and supply ships replenishing and bolstering the Marines on Guadalcanal, as well as for the forces occupying other islands in the Solomons Group. During that span of time, she visited Guadalcanal, Afate and Espiritu Santo in addition to New Caledonia. She returned to the United States at San Diego in October, and by 5 November was back at Espiritu Santo. On 13 November, she departed to participate in the Gilbert Islands operation. From 19 to 23 November, she was a part of the Air Support Group of the Southern Attack Force, and her planes bombed Tarawa, while the ships in the Northern Attack Force engaged the enemy at Macon. Following the occupation of the Gilberts, the escort carrier returned to the U.S. via Pearl Harbor, arriving in San Diego on 21 December. She remained on the West Coast for 2 weeks into the new year, then set a course for Lahaina Roads in the Hawaiian Islands. She departed Hawaii on the 22nd of January 1944 and headed for the Marshalls. During that operation, Suwannee joined the Northern Attack Force, and her planes bombed and strafed Wara and Namor Islands, in the northern part of Kwajalein Atoll, and conducted anti-submarine patrols for the task force. She remained in the vicinity of Kwajalein for the first 15 days of February, then spent the next 9 days helping out at Eniwetok. On the 24th of February, she headed east again and arrived at Pearl Harbor on the 2nd of March for a 2-week stay. By the 30th of March, she was in the vicinity of the Palau Islands as the Fifth Fleet subjected those islands to 2 days of extensive bombing raids. A week later, she put into Espiritu Santo for 4 days. After short stops at Purvis Bay in the Solomons and at Seadler Harbor, Manus, the escort carrier headed for New Guinea. For 2 weeks, she supported the Hollandia landings by shuttling replacement aircraft to the larger fleet carriers actually engaged in air support of the landings. She returned to Manus on the 5th of May, following 2 voyages from Espiritu Santo, one to Tulungi and the other to Kwajalein. Suwannee arrived off Saipan in mid-June. For the next 1.5 months, she supported the invasion of the Marianas, participating in the campaigns against Saipan and Guam. On the 19th of June, as the Battle of the Philippine Sea began to unfold, Suwannee was one of the first ships to draw enemy blood when one of her planes flying combat air patrol attacked and sank the Japanese submarine I-184. Suwannee's planes did not actually become engaged in the famous Battle of Naval Aircraft, because they remained with the invasion forces in the Marianas providing anti-submarine and combat air patrols. On the 4th of August, she cleared the Marianas for any wet dock in Seadler Harbor, reaching the latter port on the 13th of August. Almost a month later, on the 10th of September, she put to sea to support the landings on Morotai in the Netherlands East Indies. Those landings went off without opposition on the 15th of September, and Suwannee returned to Seadler Harbor to prepare for the invasion of the Philippines. On the 12th of October, the escort carrier got underway from Manus in Rear Admiral Thomas L. Sprague's escort carrier group to provide air support for the landings at Leyte Gulf. She reached the Philippines several days later, and her planes began strikes on enemy installations in the Visayas until the 25th of October. She provided air support for the assault forces with anti-submarine and combat air patrols and strikes against Japanese installations ashore. On 24-25 October 1944, the Japanese launched a major surface offensive from 3 directions to contest the landings at Leyte Gulf. While Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile force sailed south from Japan and drew the bulk of Admiral William Halsey's 3D fleet off to the north, Admiral Shima's second striking force, along with Admiral Shoji Nishimura's force, attempted to force the Surigao Strait from the south. This drew Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf's bombardment group south to meet that threat in the Battle of Surigao Strait, with Admiral Oldendorf's old battleships fighting in Surigao Strait and Halsey's Third Fleet scurrying north. Suwannee, with the other 15 escort carriers and 22 destroyers and destroyer escorts, formed the only Allied naval force operating off Leyte Gulf when Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's first striking force sneaked through the unguarded San Bernardino Strait into the Philippine Sea. Just before 7 o'clock on the 25th, one of Kadashan Bay's planes reported a Japanese force of 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. This force, Kurita's, immediately began a surface engagement with Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's Taffy 3, the northernmost group of escort carriers. Suwannee was much farther south as an element of Rear Admiral Thomas Sprague's Taffy 1. Consequently, she did not participate in the running surface battle off Samar. Her problems came from another quarter. At 7:40 on the 25th, Taffy 1 was jumped by land-based planes from Devo in the first deliberate suicide attack of the war. The first one crashed into Santee, and 30 seconds later, Suwannee splashed a kamikaze during his run on Petrov Bay. Her gunners soon shot down another enemy plane, then bore down on a third circling in the clouds at about 8,000 feet. They hit the enemy, but he rolled over, dove at Suwannee and crashed into her at 0804 about 40 feet forward of the after elevator, opening a 10-foot hole in her flight deck. His bomb compounded the fracture when it exploded between the flight and hangar decks, tearing a 25-foot gash in the latter and causing a number of casualties. Medical Officer Lieutenant Walter B. Burwell wrote, "One of our corpsmen tending the wounded on the flight decks or the plight of those isolated by fire on the forecastle. He came below to report that medical help was critically needed there. It seemed to me that we would have to try to get through to them, so he and I restocked our first aid bags with morphine syrups, tourniquets, sulfur, Vaseline, and bandages, commandeered a fire extinguisher and made our way forward, dodging flames along the main deck. Along part of the way, we were joined by a sailor manning a seawater fire hose with fairly good pressure, and though the seawater would only scatter the gasoline fires away from us by using the water and foam alternatively as we advanced, we managed to work our way up several decks, through passageways along the wrecked and burning combat information center and decoding area, through officers' country, and finally out on the forecastle. Many of the crew on the forecastle and the catwalks above it had been blown over the side by the explosions, but others trapped below and aft of the forecastle area found themselves under a curtain of fire from aviation gasoline pouring down from burning planes on the flight deck above. Their only escape was to leap a flame into the sea, but some were trapped so that they were incinerated before they could leap. By the time we arrived on the forecastle, the flow of gasoline had mostly consumed itself, and flames were only erupting and flickering from combustible areas of water and oil. Nonetheless, the decks and bulkheads were still blistering hot, and ammunition in the small arms locker on the deck below was popping from the heat like strings of firecrackers. With each salvo of popping, 2 or 3 more panicky crewmen would leap over the side, and we found that our most urgent task was to persuade those poised on the rail not to jump, by a combination of physical restraint and reassurance that fires were being controlled and that more help was on the way. Most of the remaining wounded in the forecastle area were severely burned beyond recognition and hope. Within 2 hours, her flight deck was sufficiently repaired to enable the escort carrier to resume air operations. Suwannee's group fought off 2 more air attacks before 1300, then steamed in a northeasterly direction to join Taffy 3 and launch futile searches for Kurita's rapidly retiring force. Just after noon on the 26th of October, another group of kamikazes jumped Taffy 1. Zero crashed into Suwannee's flight deck at 12:40 and careened into a torpedo bomber which had just been recovered. The 2 planes erupted upon contact, as did 9 other planes on her flight deck. The resulting fire burned for several hours, but was finally brought under control. The casualties for 25-26 October were 107 dead and 160 wounded. The escort carriers put into Kossol Roads in the Palaus on the 28th of October, then headed for Manus for upkeep on the 1st of November. After 5 days in Seadler Harbor, Suwannee got underway to return to the west coast for major repairs. She stopped at Pearl Harbor overnight on 19-20 November and arrived at Puget Sound Navy Yard on the 26th of November. Her repairs were completed by the 31st of January 1945, and, after brief stops at Hunters Point and Alameda, California, she headed west and back into the war. The escort carrier stopped at Pearl Harbor from 16 to 23 February, at Tulungi from 4 to 14 March, and at Ulithi from 21 to 27 March, before arriving off Okinawa on the 1st of April. Her first assignment was close air support for the invasion troops, but, within a few days, she settled down to a routine of pounding the kamikaze bases at Sakashima Gun 2. For the major portion of the next 77 days, her planes continued to deny the enemy the use of those air bases. Periodically, she put into the anchorage at Kariamareto to rearm and replenish, but she spent the bulk of her time in air operations at sea. On the 16th of June, she headed for San Pedro Bay in Leyte Gulf. She remained there for a week, then returned to the Netherlands East Indies at Makassar Strait to support the landings at Balikpapan, Borneo. The carrier re-entered San Pedro Bay on the 6th of July and spent the next month there. On the 3rd of August, she got underway for Okinawa, arriving in Buckner Bay 3 days later. Hostilities ended on the 15th of August, but Suwannee remained at Okinawa for the next 3 weeks. On the 7th of September, US Van Valkenburg stood out of Buckner Bay in company with Anthony, Wadsworth Beale, and Amin, as screen for the carriers Suwannee, Chenangoud, Cape Gloucester, and Birmingham, bound for Japan and occupation duty in the erstwhile enemy's waters. For the week that followed, the group operated off the coast of Kyushu, southwest of Nagasaki, Japan, while aircraft from the carriers patrolled the island and coast and assisted in locating mines in the clearance operations, paving the way for entry into the harbor at Nagasaki. The ships had entered Nagasaki harbor by the 15th of September, while Allied prisoners of war were taken on board the hospital ship US Haven. The carriers were sent there because of the medical facilities and doctors. The Chenango left Nagasaki on the morning of the 15th of September with war prisoners. Crew members of the Suwannee were given shore leave during the stay and observed the devastation of Ground Zero first-hand. The Suwannee and all the other ships in port experienced very difficult circumstances when a typhoon hit on the 17th of September. While moored between two buoys with two 1¼ steel cables and an 8-inch hawse of both bow and stern, she lost all contact with the stern buoy and moved dangerously close to shore. The bow cables and hawser held and she remained safely in place by turning the screws to maintain position. On the 21st of September, the Suwannee departed Nagasaki and remained at sea until she made a quick 7-hour stop at the outer harbor of Nagasaki before heading toward Kobe. That stop was aborted because of a minefield on the path there, so they returned south to Wakayama on the 27th of September. On the 2nd of October, Suwannee Captain Charles C. MacDonald and Rear Admiral William Sample, who headed COMCARDIV-22 on board the Suwannee, took off in a Martin PBM Mariner to maintain the flight qualifications and never returned. They were declared dead on the 4th of October. During this time, the US Suwannee was transferred from the U.S. 9th Fleet to the 5th Fleet. They remained at Wakayama until the morning of the 4th of October and again ran into a typhoon. They then spent a few days in the port of Kyoto just south of Hiroshima, and then they returned near Wakayama on the 10th of October for Typhoon Anchorage as another storm was approaching. They once again anchored in Wakayama on the 13th for about 2 days and then headed north to Tokyo, arriving on the evening of the 18th of October. About this time the Suwannee received orders detaching them from the fleet and assigned them to Operation Magic Carpet. The ship reached Saipan around 1,500 hours on the 28th of October and stayed just long enough to load stores and 400 troops. Then on to Guam, arriving at 1,700 hours on the 29th of October to load approximately 35 planes, then on to Pearl Harbor. For the November participation in Operation Magic Carpet, they were part of a much larger contingency of ships in the Pacific, all the 1,430,000 Navy, Coast Guard and Marine personnel and the 1,360,000 Army people, except those in occupation units, are scheduled to be returned by June. Engaged in the Pacific operations as of the 10th of November were 489 ships having space for slightly under 700,000 passengers. Included were 6 battleships, 7 large carriers, 4 Independence-class carriers, 45 escort carriers, 21 light cruisers, 164 troopships, 165 assault transports, 30 hospital transports, 7 converted Liberties and 40 miscellaneous craft. After a stop in Hawaii, the Suwannee was sent to Long Beach and had a short dry dock period. Then it was back to Operation Magic Carpet on the 4th of December. This trip was to be a non-stop return to Okinawa to pick up 1,500 troops on an overnight stop, and then return to Seattle. Because of bad weather, they did not arrive in Okinawa until the 21st of December. In mid-January, the Suwannee unloaded many grateful troops in Los Angeles and then headed north. After a few days off San Francisco, she headed for Pier 91 in Seattle and then on to Bremerton. On the 28th of October, the carrier was placed in a reserve status with the 16th Fleet at Boston, and just over 2 months later, on the 8th of January 1947, she was placed out of commission. Suwannee remained in reserve at Boston for the next 12 years. She was redesignated an escort helicopter aircraft carrier CVE-27 on the 12th of June 1955. Her name was struck from the Navy list on the 1st of March 1959. Her hulk was sold to the Branson Steamship Company of New York City on the 30th of November 1959 for conversion to merchant service. The project was subsequently cancelled and, in May 1961, her hulk was resold to the J.C. Berquit Company, also of New York City. She was finally scrapped in Bilbao, Spain, in June 1962. Awards. Suwannee earned 13 battle stars during World War II.